Well, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you're viewing and joining us from today. I appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar, which will wrap up the series that I've been doing for quite some time on trauma. And my name is Avis Garcia. I am a member of the Northern Arapaho tribe. I am also Eastern Shoshone on my father's side from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. I have earned my doctorate, my master's, and my bachelor's all from the University of Wyoming. My PhD is in counseling, education, and supervision. I have been working in the mental health and substance abuse field for 20 years now. So if that tells you a little bit about my age. I have a lot of experience working with Native Americans and the cultural adaptation of evidence-based practices into the mental health professions. And today's presentation is going to focus on intergenerational trauma. Early into the beginning of my series, I do special presentations based upon request. I do a lot of research on the presentations that I do. So today's work is based on a lot of research that I've done. I also want to point out that when I do my presentations, I present from my viewpoint as a Northern Arapaho. So a lot of what I will talk about comes from my tribe and my history and my background and my viewpoint, because I know that there are over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. I can't speak for them all. So I know that we share a lot of common themes. So I usually, let people know I'm not speaking for everyone. I'm speaking from where I come from when I do my presentations. I also want to let everyone know that I want to preface this presentation today because I would like you to all remember to follow up with some self-care. A lot of what I'm going to share today can be a bit traumatizing to some people, and it is a part of the work that we do in the helping profession and helping others to heal from trauma that are struggling with mental health and substance abuse issues as a result of this colonialism that you'll see as I proceed with the presentation that I'm giving here today. So let me get started with the slides here. Okay, down to the bottom. And we'll save the questions for the end so that I can keep us moving right along. Today's objectives include, we'll go over some of the history, again, from my viewpoint, the culture, implications for substance abuse, suicide, talk about the historical trauma theory, talk about epigenetics. I will cover the ACE studies that's been done on Native Americans across the country, forced acculturation, boarding schools, and addiction and trauma, how we can help, some prevention and healing suggestions, and also cover cultural considerations. Okay. Part of the history, unlike many other ethnic minorities, Native Americans had resources and means to survive. Again, at the beginning of this presentation, we acknowledged the land that we're all on, that was all indigenous land at one time. So we were surviving on this land when we knew how to survive on the land. Like I said, there are 576 federally recognized tribes with 175 languages. The Europeans introduced disease that decreased the native population to 10% of what they were at the end of the 18th century. But we're still here. Okay. Some more of the history continued. In 1887, the US government judged that the natives couldn't manage the land, so they placed the property in a trust. By removing the land and forming reservations, families were displaced and separated. The existing literature points to the importance of non-native practitioners understanding the unique history of Native people and the impact of this history on contemporary realities. This includes understanding the legacy of historical trauma and the related unresolved grief. American Indians are not considered a racial minority groups, but rather members of sovereign nations, which are separate and distinct political entities. Therefore, we have dual citizenship. We have formal tribal government leadership, structure, and protocols. Again, throughout my experience in working with other tribes, each federally recognized tribe operates their government however they see fit for their community and their people. And when we look at the history of what Indian nations have suffered, we have gone through warfare and genocide. Here is a photo here on the left-hand side of mass graves, how several Native American, when they tried to exterminate us, were just piled into graves like that. And then there's also the removal and the relocation. And the picture that I have here on the right marks the Sand Creek Massacre battleground that is on the close to the Wyoming and Colorado borderline. Originally, we were in the Colorado area, the Denver area, but because the US government decided that they wanted the land, they tried to remove us and force us out. So that is something that the Arapaho people have endured. And so this is what I talk about when I say I speak specifically from where I come from. And I know each tribe has their own traumas that they've endured. More on the historical trauma is the government attempted to remove our food sources. This whole pile here on the left-hand side is buffalo skulls. The buffalo were almost extinct at one time, and now several native tribes are now replenishing their buffalo herds on the reservations. Ours is one of them. Both the tribes on the Wind River Reservation now have buffalo, and that was our main food source about 150 years ago. So this was an attempt to starve us. And then there were also the conditions on the reservation. So they had a really hard time with being forced onto reservations and not having the freedom to be nomadic as we were. We followed the buffalo and the food that we ate. They followed and hunted, and that was disrupted by the federal government. And when we look at the culture and society, this is data that I'm sharing from work that I did on my reservation. I did a tribal epidemiology report this is outdated, but it's still pretty current information. And one of the things that caught my attention was we have a 50% high school graduation rate. I myself am a high school dropout, so I like to let people know everywhere that just because you didn't finish high school doesn't mean that you still can't go out and get a PhD or whatever it is you want to pursue if you put your mind to it. Native Americans have 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the population. So a lot of the people struggle financially. 50% of Native Americans on our near reservations are unemployed. So there is a high unemployment rate. Again, that high school graduation rate has a lot to do with that. The median family income on the reservation where I come from was $40,360. About 31% lived below the poverty level. Many drop out of high school and do not finish college. Also, I share my first attempt at college, I totally failed everything. I had to learn from my failures to go back and get things right. So I like to share that also to encourage people. And many households are headed by females. When I did research on the college graduates in my tribe, there were 40 women that were interviewed by another non-native researcher for her dissertation. And she was looking also at what contributed to these women being successful in obtaining their bachelor degrees from the University of Wyoming. And every single one of the women that she interviewed was head of a household, mostly single parents, but they all got their degrees. So if you want to look at the positive side of that. As far as implications for substance abuse, one of the big things, one of my pet peeves that gets to me is one of the cultural stereotypes of all Native Americans are, alcoholics and addicts, which isn't true. There are a lot of people on the reservation that do not use any substances at all. So the acculturation stress and the decreased economic and educational opportunities on the reservation have been implicated in understanding the increased risk for substance abuse among tribal youth. And it is important to recognize the differences in cultural values. So when we talk about acculturation stress, a perfect example would be Native Americans coming from the reservation who lived there all their life, like I did, and then going to the University of Wyoming to attend an institution that was not made for Native Americans. So we're under a great deal of stress to conform to expectations and standards that were not made for Native Americans. The alcohol and drug use, again, this is based on an epidemiology report that I conducted on my reservation that showed alcohol-related motor vehicle fatalities are higher, about 68%. Attitudes toward drinking vary. Those on the reservation are more likely to binge drink, which means they may not drink as often, but when they do, they drink heavily and for a substantial period of time. Native Americans are more likely to die, 6 times more likely to die of alcohol-related causes. So, and part of my doing this research was to explain, look at where we come from and what we've been through and why we have these issues. Cirrhosis is the 6th leading cause of death of Native Americans. 62% of violent offenses involve alcohol compared to 42% of all other races. Violent crimes experienced by Native Americans, close to half of those involve alcohol, 9% involve drug use, and 14% involve both. Suicide. Native Americans are 2 times more likely to attempt and complete suicide than the general population. And I do know the Wind River Reservation at one time had, has a lot higher rate than most other reservations do. Low self-esteem, cultural identity conflicts, lack of positive role models, an abuse history, social pressures to use substances, hopelessness and breakdown in the family are contributors to substance use that lead to increased suicidality and engagement in risky behaviors. Again, I'm sharing with you the health disparities that came out of my research on my reservation, and the life expectancy, which is our average age of death of the general population, is 78.7 years. Native Americans in the United States is 71, but look at Wyoming. We have a short life expectancy. Native Americans in Wyoming average age of death is 53 years of age. Some more vital statistics from Wyoming. This is Native Americans versus the non-Native population. If you look at the cancer, our cancer is slightly higher. The heart disease is a little higher. The accidents and adverse effects is double that of non-natives. Again, a lot of those accidents and adverse effects are drug and alcohol related. Diabetes is substantially higher. It's at 90 compared to the 23% of the non-natives. Again, look at the chronic liver disease, 87% compared to 9% of non-natives. So the liver disease also is contributed to substance abuse. And then we also have a high infant mortality rate as well. more than double that of the non-native population. Again, this just comes from Wyoming data that I gathered myself. The theory of historical trauma, it is considered clinically applicable to Native American individuals by counselors, psychologists, and psychiatrists. So it's very important that counselors and psychologists working with Native Americans always take the time to step back and think what else is going on in the picture. Native Americans subjected to traumas that are specific historical losses of population, loss of land, family, and culture, resulting in historical loss symptoms related to social, environmental, and psychological functioning that continues today. So this is what contributes to a lot of the alcoholism and drug abuse and violence. As a result, subsequent generations left with feelings of shame, powerlessness, and subordination. Denial of Native Americans to properly mourn their losses. Mourning practices were disrupted in 1883 when the federal law prohibited Native Americans from practicing traditional ceremonies. The law remained in effect until 1978. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. Brassfield in 2001 proposed diagnostic criteria for residential school syndrome, which factors in the signs and symptoms of PTSD to residential school experiences of Native Americans. Historical trauma. This term and theory comes from Dr. Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, who has her PhD in social work. She is the one who put in the research to diagnosing and treating this problem that Native Americans are affected by across the country. She defines historical trauma as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of our culture, which also contributes to the poverty, violence, poor health, suicide, unemployment, addiction, and hopelessness in many Native communities are clear symptoms of unresolved grief and pain, all due to genocide. The historical trauma response is a cluster of symptoms or behaviors such as depression, self-destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts, gestures, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, difficulty recognizing and expressing one's emotions. Literature on PTSD comes from the Jewish Holocaust. The United States has not acknowledged responsibility for the Holocaust of Native Americans. Mental health professionals and educators often lack the knowledge of tribes' history. Oppression is prevalent throughout history. Terms throughout cultural identity crisis, forced acculturation, intergenerational trauma are all unfamiliar concepts to most non-Native mental health professionals and non-Native educators. So it is very important that we begin to enlighten and educate and inform the general public to these issues when they are working to help people to learn how to heal themselves. And then there is the cultural loss for subsequent generations, because that was disrupted for, my grandparents, to my parents, to myself. This intergenerational trauma is passed on through generations. There is research, biological research that shows that this is in our DNA. And that is called epigenetics. This shows how biology contributes to cycles of trauma. How can one live with pain that you didn't personally experience? It was passed on genetically. Evidence at the cellular level shows that powerful, stressful environmental conditions can leave an imprint or a mark on the epigenome, cellular genetic material that can be carried into future generations with devastating consequences. In other words, the stresses experienced by a mother during pregnancy impacts the child who is entirely dependent on her in the womb. The presence of stress hormones in her system, all these things affect her child. Just as the way she eats and sleeps, an infant with a stressed mother has more difficulty regulating and managing their own stress reactions later on in life. This can include a predisposition to diabetes, depression, and anxiety. Babies can be born with a predisposition to PTSD and addictive behaviors due to environmental factors. Some of the articles that I read, scientists have found that memories may be passed down through generations in our DNA, taken from a book called The Mind Unleashed. Children's trauma leaves a mark on DNA of some victims. Gene-environment interaction causes lifelong dysregulation of stress hormones. So those stress hormones cause a lot of other illnesses, which can be high blood pressure, heart disease, anxiety, depression. So those stress hormones, when that is in our blood system, is not good for our health. And then there is the physical transmission of trauma. This here are direct links to the articles that specifically talks more about the transmission of trauma through our genetics. So for those of you that are interested, these are the two sites that you would want to go to pull those up. This next section is the ACE study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. This is a perfect diagram that I feel covers the whole spectrum of historical trauma and its adverse effects on American Indians and the chronic disease disparities that we all face in Indian country. So if you look at the very beginning on the left-hand side here, where there's historical trauma, and at the very bottom here in these three boxes, we have the genocide. And we have the boarding school experiences where our children in boarding school, and this was my own grandparents that had to go through this, which is the physical and sexual abuse. And I know a lot of you are watching the news, we're all wearing orange, we're thinking about, you know, our brothers and sisters up in Canada who have recently been heavily traumatized by a lot of the children that have been found. There is the neglect, the abandonment, the forced removal, loss of culture and language because they were forbidden to speak their language or practice, even to practice their own culture. They were forced into Christianity, and they lost traditional parenting and family structure because they were removed from their parents because they wanted to take everything about them that was native and forced acculturation. So then if you look at the timeline that we have across the top, we have the gestational stressors. So that is before birth. And this is where we have the Women, Infant, and Children program that now, you know, works to help families with that, which then we also look at the childhood stressors. These are the adverse childhood experiences. I have attached the ACE study questionnaire as a handout to this presentation today for those of you that want to use it. I have taken it into several groups. I do a lot of drug and alcohol work, so I've taken that into groups when I work with people, and we all fill it out. I fill it out along with them and let them know, hey, I've been through a lot of this stuff myself. I grew up in a home where I had to deal with a lot of trauma in my life. So if you look at the adverse childhood experiences, we have the physical and sexual abuse, neglect, substance abuse in the home, mental health diagnosis in the home. We've witnessed violence. We've been through, divorce or seen our parents get divorced. We've had food insecurity, and we've also had family members in prison. And then looking at the next generation, the adverse adult experiences. So everything that we've gone through as children, there is research that shows how it affects the adults, which also leads to the chronic disease disparities that we face now. Again, every social and health problem you could think of, we face it at devastatingly higher rates than the national population does. So we have alcoholism and substance abuse. We have suicide rates and death rates that are higher, poverty and poor nutrition that is higher, racism, role models. We have very few positive role models. We have many negative role models. And then the parenting has been affected drastically because of the forced removal of the children from the home that affected an entire generation across the United States of Native Americans very negatively. This pyramid here shows the relationship between early childhood trauma and health and well-being problems later in life. This source comes from the World Health Organization. So if you look at the pyramid here on the right, if we have any adverse childhood experiences, which most of us do, like I said, I could probably check every question as that I've experienced it. There's 10 questions on there. So we look at the social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. So just from those experiences, even if you've had 1 or 2, if you've had 4, you're more likely to, have more risk a lot sooner in your life. So from all of this, we have the adoption of health risk behaviors. So that may be drinking, that may be eating poorly, not exercising, using drugs, not getting help for any mental health concerns that might be there. And then we move up to the disability and disease and other social problems such as legal issues, problems with the welfare systems. And then at the very top of this diagram is early death. So those that have at least 4 of those ACE factors are at an increased risk for early death. But being aware of these can allow us to interrupt this system, hopefully down here, earlier, so that maybe we can increase that rate of death. Understanding. Existing literature on practice points to the importance of understanding the unique history of Native people and the impact of this history on contemporary realities. So we want to look at what's happened in the past to, not even just our grandparents, but our grandparents' parents as well. I mean, they're the ones that got their children taken away from them, and they didn't volunteer to do that. So it had a lot of emotional trauma. All points of the legacy of historical trauma and the related unresolved grief. So a lot of people are still struggling with a lot of loss that was endured during that time. So this, when you look at the practice issues of working to help people that are struggling with this, it also includes the forced relocation of Native American people and the impact of boarding schools. Boarding schools broke apart families and forbade us to use the Native language, practice of traditions, and spirituality. I was just sharing my story with someone last night of how my grandfather ran away from the boarding school on our reservation in the 6th grade because he couldn't learn English very well. And he kept getting physically abused for speaking his own language. Crazy fact, Native Americans weren't allowed United States citizenship until June 2nd, 1924. Yeah, that's pretty sad. Let that sink in. We lived here first for thousands of years, and less than 100 years ago, we were finally given citizenship. Federal law denial. denial of Native Americans to properly mourn their losses according to traditional cultural practices were disrupted in 1883 when the federal law prohibited all Native Americans in the country from practicing any traditional ceremonies. So they had to go underground. The Northern Arapaho people are one of the few tribes that has a lot of their ceremonies intact, but they had to be very intentional to not get caught doing that because there were consequences from the federal government for doing that. This disenfranchised grief has resulted in Native Americans not being able to carry out traditional grief practices. Again, this comes from Maria Braveheart. In 1878, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act came into effect, which allowed us to resume our practices for those that could carry them out or remembered to carry them out after all of that time period that had passed. Native Americans were unable to legally practice traditional religion until the Religious Freedom Act was enacted. As a result, subsequent generations have been left with feelings of shame, powerlessness, and subordination. Because we had no control over our own lives. The federal government did everything they possibly could to control all natives in the United States. The right to vote was governed by state law until 1957. It is important that the non-native look to the history of the tribe first to begin to understand the struggles of the people. Multicultural competence is an ethical mandate in accordance with the American Counseling Association. So I try to remind people that do seek counseling services that they have a right, if they're not feeling understood, to advocate for themselves, or it's our job to advocate for them as well. Some more of the history continued. There was historical evidence of the Northern Arapaho being in and out of the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. So we were nomadic people. We didn't stay in one place. We survived by following the buffalo so that we could eat and feed our families. So we traveled around a lot. Again, like I said, we followed the buffalo, and now I see I have a typo there. I apologize. I always see these after. The gold rush in the 1860s disrupted life and pushed the Northern Arapaho further north, and we were camped at Medicine Bow. There are several trails in the Laramie Mountains, and this is right close to the University of Wyoming. So while I was going to school there, I was, doing research. I was like, wow, they were probably right here where I'm sitting in this classroom right now at one time. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Estes Park in Colorado. That was where we also resided there for many generations, and it's probably, to me, one of the most beautiful places in the country. On November 30th of 1864 was when the Sand Creek Massacre under Colonel John Chivington occurred against the Arapaho people, which was led by Chief Black Kettle and Little Antelope at that time. And this was early in the morning. And the story that I was told was the men were out hunting to feed the women and the children. So those that were mostly left behind at that camp in the morning was women and children. And sadly, a lot of them were massacred. I am a direct descendant from that massacre. This is some quote that I got from John Chivington. He says, "Damn any man who sympathizes with the Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill them." I am like, this is so, I don't know. I'm not gonna say anything. I just wanted to share that. Forced acculturation. In 1878, a military escort moved the Northern Arapaho to the Wind River Reservation. The Shoshone were there first, so at the very beginning, there has been ongoing strife. They are the traditional enemy of the Arapaho people, and I am both tribes, so there is a little bit of, I guess, coincidence there in that I was told by my own Shoshone grandmother that my Shoshone grandfather did not like Arapaho people, and had he been there, I might not be here today. So there are a lot of people that are intermarried between two tribes, and we often refer to ourselves as we're Shorat, which means we're Shoshone and Arapaho. Then the boarding schools in the 1900s that denied the practice of cultural and spiritual ways. Many families were ripped apart, children were taken, and many children died. As we get further into this presentation, I'll share with you a little bit more about my own tribe and what we've been going through recently. In the boarding schools, Henry Richard Pratt, who is known for this quote of "kill the Indian and save the man," which was the motto, was the most prominent Indian educator of the 1800s. So this was his idea. Progressive reformers like Pratt believed it was essential to get Indian children away from their families and nations in order to prevent parents from raising their children in their own culture. So the reformers founded boarding schools where children could be isolated from languages, values, and traditions. Cultural erasure was the main goal. Many children were physically and sexually abused and developed a variety of problematic coping strategies, such as alcohol and drug use, suicide, denial and scapegoating other natives, which has also led to loss of ethnic identity. Removal of children from families is one of the most devastating traumas because it resulted in the disruption of the traditional Native American family structure. These are actual tiny handcuffs used by the United States government to restrain captured Native American children and drag them from their families to send them to Indian boarding schools, where their identities, cultures, and their right to speak their language was forcefully stripped away from them. Another quote from General Richard Pratt. He is the founder of the Carlisle Indian School. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. And this Indian school founder says, "I agree with this sentiment, but only this, that all Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." As I shared, I am Eastern Shoshone. I'm enrolled Northern Arapaho, but I looked at both tribes and how this affected them both on our Wind River Reservation. And this picture right here is taken at Fort Washakie at the Roberts Episcopal Mission. Sadly, in this picture, half of these children died while they were in this boarding school. Here is a picture that we see quite frequently. This is from the Carlisle Indian School in 1890. You can see all these children in the picture here. I forget how many thousand they actually had altogether, but they came from Indian tribes all across the country. But if you look at all of the boys, their hair is all cut. If you look at all of the girls, their hair is all cut and they're all wearing the clothes that they're wearing. I don't know about other tribes. Like I said, I only speak from where I come from, and it is one of our cultural grieving practices when we lose someone in our family to cut our hair, which is a sign of our mourning, but also great respect for that person that we lost. So sadly, when I look at this picture, I also think about the fact that all of these children are grieving everything that they lost in their life. Here is another picture of 13 Northern Arapaho children that left our reservation. Look at these young men, look at their long braids. See how long their hair was? And 2 Shoshone children arriving in Carlisle Indian School in 1881. So this is them when they arrived. They were all dressed traditionally. This picture is courtesy of the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center. Little Plume in the back row, far left. Little Chief, the last row, second, right there. And Little Horse in the front row, second from the right. There he is right there. Little Chief is Chief Sharpnose's son. And he is one of the leaders of the Arapaho people. In 2017, in July, our tribe went to the Carlisle Indian School to exhume the remains of 3 Arapaho children, these 3 that I pointed out to you. 2 were found, but Little Plume wasn't found. The grave that they opened had 2 children in there, in Little Plume's that was supposed to be his grave, that are identified. So that just goes to show what a poor job they did of taking care of our children that were there. And as far as I know, they are still looking for Little Plume, and the Army has promised that they will not stop until they find him. These are before and after pictures of Lakota boys that went to the Carlisle Indian School in the 1900s. If you see them on the left, how traditional they looked when they got there. They have the eagle feathers in their hair. They have braids. And then if you look to them on the right, how they're dressed. There goes their long, beautiful hair. The next picture here, about a month ago, I went to the Central Wyoming College in Riverton. There has been a recent documentary released called Home from School. If you go onto YouTube, there is like a 5-minute premiere of this movie. It was a very touching movie. There were 10,000 Indian children from across the country that went to the Carlisle Indian School from 1879 to 1918. There were 186 graves that were marked with tombstones, and an unknown number were buried without a tombstone. Little Chief and Little Horse remains were repatriated. They were brought back to the Wind River Reservation and given a proper ceremony. The grave marked for Little Plume contained, like I said, the bones of 2 other unidentified students. Little Plume was scheduled for disinterment with the other 2, but he is still missing. And their attempts to find him to this day have been unsuccessful. But as far as I know, they will try again. Here is the preview link for the movie. Going on to more trauma that children and families have endured across the country has been the foster care and the adoption era, where a lot of children were removed from homes and adopted by white people, where they were also sexually abused and physically assaulted and treated very poorly. You know, I've come across several people that grew up that way, and you know, they've shared their stories. And then there was the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. Here's a little flyer that says, come to Denver so you could get a good job and have a happy home, and you could get job training, and you could live in beautiful Colorado. Sadly, these attempts to promise natives a better life didn't go very well. Several actually really struggled with that. So I mean, these are ideas that the federal government comes up with. They didn't ask us what we wanted. They just always did what they assumed was in our best interest, which obviously was not. Here is a picture of a lot of female Native students in boarding school. And according to my research, they may have meant well by saying they were helping us and educating us and making us better, but they were raising our women to be service workers, to do laundry, to clean, to cook. They weren't teaching them to be doctors and lawyers and, you know, teachers, you name it. It was, yeah, we'll help you, but only to a certain extent. So they weren't really doing any favors. They were doing more damage, if anything, from my viewpoint. It's the same with the men. They weren't teaching any of us to excel in all areas of academics. But we are excelling now. Our numbers continue to increase. Our college graduation rates are going up. From the outcomes of all of this boarding school issue has been the loss of language. And these are from elder interviews in the Journal of Psychology in 2004. So the elders have a sense of guilt from the language not being passed on. Language loss tied to the boarding school, not being able to speak the language. The Arapaho language is an endangered language, so the tribe is working very hard to save it. The elders have said that they had a sense of hopelessness because of all of this. There has been the erosion of the traditional family and community loss of safety and caring for one another because of this. There has been a loss of land and broken treaties, and there is a strong sense of loss and despair regarding the violence, which has also led to the high rates of drug and alcohol use and loss. More outcomes, unresolved trauma and social outcomes. There is an 80% correlation between trauma and addiction. 80%. So that just goes to show those that are struggling with addiction, there's some trauma underneath there. About 2/3 of people in recovery for addiction have experienced one or more symptoms of the ACE. Again, I've attached that questionnaire for you guys to all use. Research evidence consistently finds elevated rates of trauma among incarcerated individuals. So research has been done on natives that are in prison, again, high rates of trauma. And then 75 to 93% of 93,000 children incarcerated, these are children incarcerated, are juveniles, have one or more ACE factors. And this comes from a book called Healing Invisible Wounds, Why Investing in Trauma-Informed Care Makes Sense. So when we work with all children in Indian country, we should take that trauma-informed care approach because we do not know where they've come from and what they've been through. We can only assume based on what I'm sharing with you today. Looking at addiction and trauma, experience of trauma increases the likelihood of turning to substances to cope. They want to numb out. I know I've talked to some people that are in successful recovery, and that's exactly what they said they did. They said it was my way to escape. They self-medicate. They escape painful emotions, and they feel like they have a sense of control in using drugs and alcohol to regulate and relieve intense feelings, to suppress painful memories, to find some relief, and gain a sense of control. In the beginning, this does work the way they say right here, but with continued use is when they develop that physical addiction to the substance, and it starts to create more problems on top of what they're already experiencing. With substance use, there is a reenactment of the trauma. This is where the violence comes in. Expression of self-blame and self-hate. This is their self-soothing. Maintained sense of self if feeling threatened with loss of identity. Escape perceived rejection. Substance is that loyal friend. Express ownership. It's my body, it's my life. And it's also a way for them to feel like they have a connection with others. I've had many people tell me they were lonely and that using substances was took that lonely feeling away. Substance functions, initial impulse to self-medicate appears to help. Stability expectations from substances can appear reliable compared to human relationships. So rather than try to have a healthy relationship, using substances seems to be the more preferred route. Alcohol lowers agitation, initially sedates, a spiking cortisol reaction from the traumatic event, sleep disturbances, nightmares, and other intrusive symptoms. So this is what functions the substances serves the trauma survivor. Opioids calms feelings of rage and aggression. Cocaine and methamphetamine has an antidepressant impact. So, I mean, it mimics what they're seeking. Trauma was experienced beyond the survivor's control, and substance use leads to further loss of control, which spirals out of control. So the real impacts of using substances to cope with trauma is it compounds the original symptoms, it exacerbates the discomfort, increases alienation from others and self, promotes greater dysfunction, keeps the survivor from finding healthy ways to cope, prevents from getting their needs met, takes away their control, leading to loss of control in their life. That's when they lose their jobs, their homes, their family, you name it, they begin to lose everything. And it also prevents their healing. It just makes it a lot worse. Which also leads to learned helplessness. The individual cannot process their own way back to normal response patterns. The longer an individual is in an uncontrollable situation, the greater number of times they will practice inappropriate responses. Days, months, years, decades, generations of building highly practiced inappropriate response, such as drinking, drugs, violence, breaking the law, and other process addictions. So when I talk about process addictions, I'm talking about gambling, shopping, eating, playing video games, being hooked on the internet, or, you know, a lot of people are spending a lot of time on social media. We had the discussion at work yesterday of people deleting their accounts because they feel like they're on there too much and that it wasn't healthy. How to help? Culturally based care or culturally based treatment. Traditional practices of Western models of care adapted for Native Americans. I like to tell people that, yes, I am a licensed professional counselor. Yes, I am a mental health provider, but everything that I've read and studied, none of it was made for Native Americans by Native Americans. From my own personal life experience, I tell people I never went to counseling. I think I went one time when I lost someone in my family. My brother had committed suicide. For those of you that follow me, I do a suicide presentation and I talk about that. But I did go try to get help. They gave me some pills that all they did was make me sleep and sleep and sleep. And how I overcame that was relying on our cultural traditions, our practices. I participated in our fasting, and I always tell people the Native American church saved my life because my grandfather took me to NAC meetings like quite a bit, and each time I went, I felt myself getting better and better. And so I tell people, you know what works for you, you know what your people have done for hundreds of years. Do those things if you can, because that is the most helpful from my viewpoint. But then you have to do that cultural assessment, because there are some natives who have assimilated or gone away from those practices. So those people might be more helped by the Western theories and therapies and interventions that were created for non-native people. So it's good to keep that in mind. It's good to involve the community and the family, emphasizing relationships and respects, having an open door policy as a foundation for culturally relevant interventions. So those of you that live in your community that know who does what so that you can help people get the help that they need. And Notice the difference in communication patterns, including the ability to tolerate silence. In the Arapaho people, the good way of life is the quiet way of life. And also in my years of research, especially on Native Americans, I also minored in American Indian studies. So I studied my own tribe and learned that it is the quiet is highly valued. So a lot of our youth that will come, if they show up to therapy or group, they're often pretty quiet. I was pretty quiet at one time. And in order to get where I am today, I had to step out of my comfort zone and learn how to be comfortable being uncomfortable so that I could get my degree. And, I had to pass this on to my daughter who just got her master's degree. I told her she was one of the shyest of my 3 children. And I told her, you got to speak up. You got to talk. Your whole program is going to be presentation after presentation. And now I'm pretty proud of her because she just got her master's this spring. So not only is the communication pattern, but also the communication norm of Natives of storytelling. As you hear me as I present, I'm a storyteller. Even as a teacher, I'm a storyteller. Even as a counselor, I'm a storyteller. But we've been storytellers all our life as Native people. Like I said, the Northern Arapaho were nomadic, and so we couldn't carry books and paper with us. It was stories. We shared and passed on knowledge and continue to do that by telling stories. And understanding humor, we like to laugh and joke and have fun. I'm at work and I don't know how many times I hear the women just bust out and laughing. So I thought, well, they must be having a good time doing their job. And being patient with people, because Natives, when they come for help, it's not a comfortable environment for them. They need time to warm up and adjust. So we need to respect them and allow that. Looking at treatment and prevention. So when you look at the Native Americans and the traditional AA, the values that we have. And so just our values alone, the Native Americans have an uncritical attitude, and the AA program has a critical attitude. Traditional, non-Native values are competition, and Native Americans is not competition, it's cooperation. We have sharing, and then there's ownership. And this is looking at, there is a Native American AA called the Red Road to Recovery through the Don Coihis White Buffalo organization, or the White Bison, and then the traditional. So if you look at the Native Americans, we have the humble presentation versus the outgoing and self-righteous. So if you look at these as just not only the AA, but as values in general, you'll see that there's the opposites. There is conflict in that. Looking at the healing journey, Joseph Gahn in 2009 did a really good research that focused on community-based treatment for Native Americans that addresses historical trauma and prospects for evidence-based practice. And 4 themes emerged from his data, which was the introspective process of looking at yourself, necessary for long-term therapeutic objective, refashioning the self in transformative ways throughout one's life to work on yourself. Always in the waking, armed with the novel insights, clients can be empowered to commence the remaking of themselves through ongoing lifelong habits of introspection and self-examination that effectively construed the self as a therapeutic project in need of regular attention. So it's the constant working on yourself. And I do this constantly myself. I'm always striving to be better and do better. And the healing journey can be described as this lifelong process of conscientious self-engagement designed to achieve wellness and fulfillment. So the 4 themes that he came about in his study was that a lot of people have emotional burdens of carrying the pain. Instead of forgetting it and leaving it and move on, they pick it up and take it with them wherever they go. And then there's the Cathartic Self-Disclosure. So to confess and purge the influence. So, people like to get that out, tell your story, change the story. Self as a project of reflexivity, again, lifelong, and looking at the impact of colonization to reclaim the Indigenous heritage, identity, and spirituality. So getting back to where we come from, our historical roots. Continuing with the healing journey, not just for the self, but for the community, to review residential schools as a salient expression of colonization. And I don't look at just the residential schools. I look at like a majority of the schools, and more schools are now starting to look at having more Native teachers and looking at Indigenous curriculum and teachings in the schools that are more appropriate to the students that are there. So the 3 links that are central to the healing process is culture, to relearn those traditional practices, the language, the history, reconceptualization of life experience in context of European colonization. So, look at how that has affected us. How can you change that? And identity, a more robust post-colonial Indigenous identity by reclaiming cultural and spiritual practices. Again, going back to our roots. Native hope is coming to terms with the past and our people's history, one's own story and own past. It's not our fault. This is somebody else's doing. And begin to truly heal and step into greater freedom, greater hope, greater responsibility to live differently than before. The point of talking about historical trauma and how it is passed down is not to encourage Native people to feel hopelessness and despair, nor to feel like a permanent victim. It's quite the opposite. Native hope wants to encourage people to come to terms with their own stories, their own past, offer yourself forgiveness and compassion to understand that much of the difficulty you may face is not your fault. And then one can begin to truly heal and step into greater freedom, greater hope, greater responsibility to live life differently and better than before. Hope and courage. When you share your story, embracing the pain and joy that is a part of your journey, we can offer a powerful witness to others and encourage others to rise up to healing. So fully embracing our stories and our past, we choose to end cycles of grief and trauma in order to better life for the next generation. We can let go of bad patterns, let the cycles of abuse and addiction die. There are strong Native men and women that are finding healing now, and they are also in this line of work helping others. I have 2 awesome people on my staff that I'm so glad that they're there. And we believe stories have healing power, and science backs this up. This is referred to narrative therapy and Western counseling methods, but I really look at it as traditional Native therapy because we are storytellers, sharing stories of hope and healing. Some cultural constructs, you would like to include the family. A lot of times we use the sweat lodge back home and we bring the family members in to work together. Having respect, spirituality, and traditionalism. So again, this all comes back to the roots of our cultural beliefs of whatever tribe it is you may belong to. Integrate that into treatment and prevention in order to gain acceptance from Native American help seekers. So, we're there to help. Our whole life as Native Americans is based on balance. Like, you got to live your life, and I've often heard harmony of having all of these parts of your life in order. So we have the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and the mental. And the overall, again, looking at Western theory, their focus on this is called wellness. So we have the 4 cardinal directions, the races of humankind, the cyclical movement of time. We have the 4 seasons, the 4 stages of human development. Red is for understanding the trauma. Yellow is releasing the trauma. Black is confronting the trauma, so we go through the darkness, and white is transcending the pain. I have a worksheet that I've attached as another handout that is this medicine wheel. It's got some blank spaces in it. I use it for a lot of everything that I do with natives, and non-natives enjoy it too. I use it as a relapse prevention plan. I use it as a, mental health of taking care of yourself plan. You can use it for yourself as your own wellness plan and filling in the things that you're going to do in those areas to balance yourself. Manageable. As with other diseases, addicts are not responsible for their disease, but they are responsible for what they do about their disease, and they are fully responsible for their behaviors at every stage of healing. Women do get better if treatment addresses both addiction and trauma. Like I said, I am now the director of behavioral health for the Crow Nation Recovery Center. And I overheard some of the people talking about how we have to address this first and then that, and then well, if we do this and send them there to go deal with that, we lose them because then they don't come back to finishing the whole. But it is co-occurring disorders, co-occurring treatment that needs to be treated at the same time, simultaneously, concurrently. So we treat the trauma and the addiction at the same time, not one separately. We've got to work with those together. Here is a picture that has a picture of the sweat lodge, and this is where it says this is where we heal our pain. My whole dissertation is focused on use of the sweat lodge and how it is used to heal our pain. Again, speaking from my own, where I come from, this has been a huge foundation of my life that I continue to use to this day. We need to learn to look at being able to accept that we're going through these emotions, and I focus on coping skills. And so this is what I often refer to as riding the wave of, sometimes we're going to get depressed, sometimes we're going to have anxiety, but what are your coping skills? What do you do when you're feeling down? What do you do when you're feeling a little bit anxious? So learning to embrace it and be like, okay, I've been there before, I can do this again. Also looking at the individual's capabilities, which is being strengths-based. You always want to focus on what are their strengths. Looking at positive viewpoints, their self-efficacy and self-regulation of, again, what do you do when you're feeling down? I like to watch funny movies. I have several favorite funny movies that helps me when I think everybody has bad moments in life, but this is that metaphor of, is the glass half full or is it half empty? How do we see it? So if we could look at that in a positive light. Treatment and prevention continued. Native cultures contain all the necessary knowledge to socialize mentally healthy substance-free youth. This knowledge needs not to be replaced with information or socialization derived from European culture. So stick to the basics of what your tribe knows, what your beliefs are. Cultural ways and knowledge must be viewed as equal to social science, prevention, and treatment knowledge. There exists within Native cultures developmental risk and protective factors. Treatment must be culturally specific to be successful. Some more cultural considerations: sharing our stories as a way of education, keeping sessions informal in nature and conduct them in a comfortable setting, as well as allowing for a flexible start and end time, also known as Indian time. So, they don't want to work with pressure and constraints. So if you can have some flexibility in your work. When I used to see clients on a day-to-day schedule, I would intentionally insert time of maybe 15 to 30 minutes between sessions, knowing that I was giving somebody time to be late for whatever reason it is they have, because they're running on Indian time. We want to look at our culture and our spirituality. These are the most effective, best practices that were shown in the work that I did on the Wind River Reservation. Is, like I said, these have been here. This is our way of life. We just need to continue that. And then we have the storytelling. It's just a part of our culture and who we are. Some other things we might want to look at would be mindfulness, meditation, spirituality, prayer. Again, that can be a part of going to the sweat lodge. Movement can be dance, exercise, walking, CrossFit, hiking, yoga, running, other sports. Rhythm, music, singing, drumming, part of our culture. Art and creativity, again, part of our culture. One of the recovery centers I work with at home has an hour a week. It tends to run over, but the women come in and do their beading, their sewing, some do drawing, painting, crafting, and that's a part of their recovery program, and the staff are allowed to participate in it. And I noticed they really enjoyed it. And this was at the Shoshone Recovery Program on the reservation, and they had some of the most awesome women there that do some very beautiful beadwork, but they were there to share and help and teach too. I've often am asked about programs that I would recommend to people if they want to do some things in their community to address this trauma. And one of the best ones that I've attended and participated in myself that was on our Wind River Reservation, I want to say I attended at least twice, and I know they did more, but I attended 2 of them. Because I'm a counselor, they needed me to be one of the people that provided the safe space, because as they would do this presentation, some people would really open up and disclose some things and needed some support. So I was always asked if I would come and participate in that way, to be a part of that. The creator and founder of this Native Pride is Dr. Clayton Small. His curriculum is called The Good Road of Life. Like I said, I've seen it, I participated in it, I love it, I highly recommend it. It's for adults. And then the next one he has for youth is called Native Hope. It's called Helping Our People Endure. Another excellent program. If you want to look him up, I put the website up here where you can check that out, but he does really a great job. And that wraps up the end of my presentation today. Here is my email if anybody wants to reach out to me, has any questions. But I believe I've attached an article, I've attached a book on trauma that comes from SAMHSA, I attached the ACE questionnaire, and I attached my medicine wheel worksheet, because I know you guys just love all stuff that can help you. I thank you all for taking the time to be here today. It lets me know you care about yourself and your community and your people. Again, I remind you to practice some self-care after this today, because what I shared was, a difficult topic to talk about. So make sure you take care of yourself. When I work with people, especially in addictions, I always ask them to tell me, what one thing are you going to do for yourself to do some self-care for yourself today? So make sure you do that for yourself today. And we're open for questions.
Thank you so much, Avis. We really appreciate all of your words today. We had a lot of very wonderful positive feedback in the chat box, which we will share with you. And we actually had a few questions throughout the presentation. I was writing them down. If I can ask those to you, that would be great.
Okay.
So the first one is, will you be offering any additional information that might help us in understanding the disparities lifespan of those who are Indigenous living in Wyoming?
So let me see if I got this right. Will I share more information on helping people Native specifically in Wyoming?
I think they were wondering if you have anything to understand the disparities and the lifespan of those who are Indigenous living in Wyoming? I know you shared that chart where the age difference is pretty dramatic. And if you had any more additional information about why.
The why is all this intergenerational trauma. That's why here I make the connection of, because we're still healing and hurting, and this has been passed down through our genetics and through generations. Like, you know, I say it's been passed on to me through my grandparents, and when we continue to pick it up and carry it and go with it and not heal from it, that is a part of it. And being real specific to Wyoming, I mean, my link there is that a lot of our people are hurting. A lot of our people have been traumatized and have experienced trauma. And it's participating in healing for themselves and for the community, which, like I said, I do myself on a day-to-day basis of always striving to be better and always trying to make things better, but also modeling that. Like all of you that are here today, whatever you're doing to help yourself be whole, well, healthy, modeling that and sharing that with other people is really good to help people. But these disparities are not just in Wyoming, they're across the country. It just happens to be that Wyoming has higher disparities than most other tribes. And we're just one of, I think there's like 5 or 6 tribes that are heavily affected. And the Wyoming reservation is one of those that is more affected than a lot of other tribes are.
Thank you so much for that explanation. We had another question from Amanda, who said, I'm wondering, why are the boarding schools still allowed to operate? Although it is not the way it was in the past, the haunting of the past of our people is still in the grounds and in the buildings. I visited the one in Riverside, California, and the buildings look like they are old and in place from when it was originally built. They should be torn down. What are your thoughts?
That is a difficult question for me to answer, to be honest with you. I haven't visited any of the schools. I attended one boarding school, like for the first attempt at high school. Like I said, I'm a dropout. I went to Flandreau Indian School. I really feel like a lot of the boarding schools nowadays that colonization is not their intention. They are more attuned to the traumatic histories that most Native people have endured. So there is more focus on education. As far as their curriculum, I don't know. And sadly, a lot of our tribal communities lack financial resources to fix those buildings and build those buildings. So I'm like, if the federal government wants to help us, hey, we have Deborah Haaland up there, you know, hey, can we fix our buildings? Can we make them better? Our Wyoming Indian School has been very fortunate in being able to build a new school. So they have a beautiful new high school. The elementary school is also new. A lot of the schools on the reservation have been rebuilt, like torn down and rebuilt. And I really feel like that contributes to the healing and moving on in life. So that would be my opinion, is where's the money from the government that should help, you know, refurbish or rebuild these institutions.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any other questions that they would like to ask Dr. Garcia? You can type them in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself. Once again, the slideshow that she shared today, the slides and the recording, as well as the attachments, will be in the follow-up email you'll be receiving today.
Quiet. Okay, it looks like that's it. Let me see if I missed anything in the chat box from anybody. Okay.
Troy had a question about technical assistance discussion. Troy, were you wanting TA help from Dr. Garcia specifically, or our center? Both. Great. Yes, we can reach out to you. I will send you an email and I'll CC you, Avis, on that.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Paul, go ahead. You can talk. No worries.
I just wanted to say, Dr. Garcia, you are the truth. I've been to like 2 of your presentations and you always come through. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Thank you so much, Paul. We appreciate you joining us. We appreciate all of you today. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.